I want to begin with three numbers that should terrify anyone who understands how the modern world actually works. 1243 billion. 12 commercial vessels seized in a single coordinated operation. 40 Russian naval assets deployed simultaneously across three maritime theaters. $3 billion in ships and cargo now sitting in Russian custody. But here's what nobody in Washington wants to admit. This wasn't impulsive rage. This was calculated strategy. And the most dangerous part, we taught them how to do it. Let me tell you what happened in the waters surrounding Russia over the past several weeks. Russian forces operating with military precision executed simultaneous seizures of oil and LNG tankers across the Black Sea, the Baltic approaches, and Arctic shipping lanes. American-operated vessels, Allied flagged ships, all taken into Russian custody under legal justifications so carefully constructed that our own lawyers are still parsing the language. The immediate reaction in Western capitals was predictable. Outrage, emergency meetings, threats of consequences. But I have watched American foreign policy long enough to recognize when our officials are genuinely surprised. This time the shock was real, and that should concern you more than the seizures themselves. It means our strategic thinking failed to anticipate what any observer of Russian behavior should have seen coming. Now, let me challenge an assumption you probably hold. You likely believe that international maritime law protects commercial shipping. Those rules exist. They are written in treaties nearly every nation has signed. But rules only matter when someone is willing to enforce them. And when enforcement itself becomes the weapon, the rules transform into something else entirely. The story begins not in recent weeks, but in late 2022. The West, responding to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, unleashed what was described as the most comprehensive sanctions regime in modern history. SWIFT. Disconnection, central bank asset freezes, and most critically, the oil price cap. That mechanism was designed to allow Russian oil to flow while capping prices at levels that would starve Moscow's war chest. From Washington's perspective, it seemed sophisticated, calibrated, smart. From Moscow's perspective, this was the West declaring unilateral authority to dictate the terms of global energy trade. Russia could sell its oil, but only at prices set by its adversaries, and that rule would be enforced through Western control of shipping insurance, transportation, logistics, and financial infrastructure. The message was clear. Violate our terms and your ships do not sail. For nearly 2 years, Russia absorbed this pressure while quietly building alternatives. They redirected exports toward Asia. They expanded Arctic shipping capacity beyond what most analysts thought possible. They constructed new financial mechanisms to bypass Western banking systems. These were not merely economic adjustments. They were preparations for a world where Russian energy would no longer depend on Western permission. But something happened in late 2024 that transformed preparation into action. The United States and Allied naval forces began boarding and inspecting tankers suspected of carrying Russian oil above the price cap. Not in Russian waters, but in international zones where freedom of navigation should have protected them. The justification was sanctions enforcement. The reality was that economic warfare had crossed into physical coercion. Moscow's response was methodical. They documented each boarding, each assertion of Western authority over vessels Russia considered legitimate commerce. And then in mid-December came the catalyst. An American-operated tanker collided with a Russian research vessel in northern waters. Several Russian crew members died. Washington called it a tragic accident. Moscow alleged the tanker was equipped with surveillance equipment. They demanded the vessel return for criminal investigation. When it refused, Russia declared the crew fugitives. Whether you believe Moscow's version or Washington's is almost beside the point. Russia had constructed a legal framework, however contested, that justified what came next. By treating the collision as criminal rather than military, they created a pathway for actions that could be presented as lawful policing rather than acts of war. The seizures that followed were not spontaneous. Russian naval units moved simultaneously across multiple zones, boarding and escorting 12 vessels into Russian ports, The crews, hundreds of people who went to work as commercial sailors, found themselves reclassified as material witnesses in ongoing investigations. Not hostages, technically, but functionally, they are bargaining chips in a geopolitical standoff they never asked to join. What Russia has done is challenge the fundamental assumption that underwrites modern global trade, that commercial shipping operates in a neutral space protected by international law, insulated from conflicts between great powers. Even during the Cold War, that principle held. Russia has now broken that norm deliberately, using the exact playbook that Western powers taught them. Consider the logic. If American naval forces can board tankers under sanctions enforcement, even in international waters, then why cannot Russia do the same under different legal justifications? If Western systems can be weaponized to enforce price caps, then why cannot Russia use its regional military superiority to enforce its own interpretations of maritime security? This is strategic mirroring. Russia is forcing Western policymakers to confront an uncomfortable question. Can you maintain a system where you dictate rules globally but face no reciprocal vulnerability? The human cost is already mounting. Those crew members in Russian custody are people with families, mortgages, lives upended by decisions made thousands of miles away. When great powers treat commerce as an extension of warfare, ordinary people pay the price first. And here's what keeps me awake at night. The precedent being established extends far beyond Russia and the United States. If this logic gains acceptance, maritime shipping enters a new era of vulnerability. Nearly every commercial vessel carries electronics that a hostile state could characterize as surveillance equipment. Environmental regulations are broad enough to justify almost any inspection. The line between legitimate security enforcement and economic hostage-taking becomes dangerously thin. China is watching this closely. So is Iran. So is every regional power that chafes under Western maritime dominance. They are calculating whether the West possesses the resolve to protect every vessel that might be targeted in the future. More importantly, they are learning that when institutional norms crack, the fracture spreads faster than anyone expects. This is how institutional orders collapse, not through catastrophic failures, but through gradual erosion of shared assumptions about acceptable behavior. Each violation that goes unanswered becomes the new baseline. Each precedent makes the next escalation easier to justify. We are watching that process unfold in real time. The energy markets have already absorbed the lesson. Insurance rates for shipping near Russian waters have spiked dramatically. Some routes have become effectively uninsurable, which means they are commercially non-viable. Capital is flowing away from integrated supply chains toward fragmented systems that price in geopolitical risk at every node. For Europe, dependent on energy logistics that often transit Russian-controlled zones, this represents a strategic nightmare. Firms that thought they had diversified away from direct Russian dependence are discovering their alternative supply chains remain vulnerable. The economic costs will mount slowly but relentlessly. Here is the deepest irony. The sanctions regime designed to isolate Russia has, through its enforcement mechanisms, created conditions for Russia to demonstrate a different kind of power. Not the power to compete with Western financial systems, but the power to impose costs, to create chaos, to force adversaries to operate in permanent uncertainty. This is not a sign of Russian strength. It is desperation dressed up as strategic initiative. But desperate powers are often the most dangerous, precisely because they have less to lose from escalation. Russia has accepted that it cannot win a competition based on Western rules. So it is attempting to change the rules, or at least make following them so expensive that others begin to question their value. What should disturb us most is not Russia's actions, but our own failure to anticipate them. For 2 years, we imposed economic pressure through mechanisms requiring physical enforcement. We boarded ships, we froze assets, we dictated prices, and we assumed our adversaries would simply absorb these costs without developing responses. That assumption was not strategy. It was wishful thinking masquerading as policy sophistication. The question before us now is whether this becomes a one-time shock that forces recalibration or the beginning of a sustained pattern where commercial shipping is routinely targeted. The answer depends on choices not yet made. Negotiation could establish clearer boundaries. Continued escalation could normalize seizure of commercial assets as standard practice. We are entering a period where the assumptions that have governed international commerce for decades no longer hold, where economic warfare and military power are inseparable, where every major shipping route becomes a potential front in a conflict with no clear boundaries. The 12 vessels sitting in Russian custody are not just ships. They are markers of a transformation that will reshape global trade for years to come. They represent the moment when the international system's fragile norms cracked under great power competition. And they stand as a warning that the institutional order we took for granted was always more fragile than we wanted to believe. Stay attentive, stay engaged, because what happens next will determine whether we can rebuild some framework for predictable commerce, or whether we descend into a world where power, not law, determines which ships sail and which sit seized in foreign ports.